Good morning to those joining us online. Welcome back to the second day of the third weekend for the Dublin Citizens Assembly, live here in the Grand Hotel in beautiful North County Dublin in Malahide. This morning we are going to do our plenary feedback session with Dr. Theresa Reidy, who spoke to us yesterday on local government finance. And we have some questions that you want to pose to Dr. Reidy. We're going to have a session with some chambers of commerce, and then we'll hand it back to you to discuss lessons learned so far. Just to start the morning off, back to our terms of reference. Some discussions last night around that, and it's good to know that we're on track in terms of holding to the terms of reference. Just to remind ourselves that. This Citizens Assembly, which is known as our Dublin Citizens Assembly, shall be convened to consider the type of directly elected mayor and local government structures that are best suited to Dublin and to bring forward proposals in that regard. I think we all agree, well certainly the consensus was, that I was picking up last night, is that we're moving towards that. Bit of work to be done yet, but we're moving in the right direction as we pass the halfway post in our aim to have our report into the Oireachtas by November. So if you look at the stages that we're through, we're on stage, the third stage. Yesterday we had the devolution of powers discussion, which created some stimulus, some tension, but I look at it as creative tension. Got people thinking about why we're here, and we're very purposeful in terms of our intent and why we're here to do a job on behalf of the citizens of Dublin City and County. We spoke with the finance bit that we're going to wash up very shortly. We have the commerce piece I mentioned, and then what have you learned so far? We'll, as we mentioned yesterday and again last evening, we are beginning to solidify our thoughts on the 10th of September. I'll come back to that in my closing remarks, and then we're going to get a report in by November. So to start the proceedings, we're going to welcome again. Please give a warm welcome to Dr. Theresa Reidy, who is with us on stage to answer your questions. So the facilitators have given us the questions. We have quite a number to get through. We have approximately a half an hour to do that. And the first question is from table 4, please, and Kieran. It was about evidence-based research. We go to the table, okay. All right, we'll stay with number 4, please. And Kieran, your question on your evidence-based research. Thank you.
Hi, Kieran, table 4. From the evidence-based research, could you give us the different options of raising money at local government to us for consideration?
All right, thanks, Kieran. I suppose the first thing to say is that we actually now have most of the major components of a revenue base for local government funding that's quite similar to other European countries. The big gap in our funding base was the local property tax, and that came in first as the household charge and then evolved into the local property tax. So that was actually the one major component that was missing in our revenue base. And so now we're actually broadly in line in terms of the different components we have. Where we're still, I suppose, different to other European countries is in the rates that we levy. So in particular, the amount of money we raise from the local property tax is really, really small in comparison to other European countries. So yesterday I was showing you it's about kind of 7% of total revenue for local authorities comes in from local property tax. You know, in a lot of other European countries, that would be heading upwards towards about 25%. And it's probably worth knowing that the amounts that people pay in property tax annually in this country are what you would pay monthly in quite a number of other European countries. That would be at the upper end now, okay, so that's a spectrum. So we're on one end of the spectrum where it's really quite low, and the higher ends of the spectrum, which would be some of the Nordic countries, but Germany, France, for example, all have quite high levels of local property tax. So I don't know many of your property owners, but think about how much you pay a year and think about paying that every month. Now, of course, you don't have to connect that to services and to the kind of that's very important. It's not like you would be the property tax would go up for no reason. It would map onto additional service delivery. But in terms of a comparative European examination, looking at where do our local authorities get their money from, well, actually we have most of the major components that are the same as other European countries, but we just happen to levy particularly property tax at a lower rate. If we go beyond Europe, in particular, there are kind of tax sharing or tax splitting arrangements that you find in other countries, other jurisdictions. You get local sales taxes, local purchase taxes. That's particularly common in the United States. Any of you who have been to the States, you go to the counter to buy something and suddenly an extra 8 or 9% gets added to the total. That's usually a state tax or a local tax that is applied. Now, of course, we already have a quite high VAT, so there probably isn't much scope to be adding local sales or property taxes. But there are also local business taxes that you could get as well. But again, I'm not sure how much political appetite there would be for those. But the one real thing where we stand out would be increasing the property tax. But I do appreciate for the political people in the room that that's not an entirely popular thing to be knocking on doors trying to sell.
Thanks, Table 4 and Kieran, for that question. The ear Taoiseach, Mr. Bertie Hearn, yesterday mentioned or referenced a hotel bed tax, and Table 10 and Ruth have a similar question.
Good morning. My name is Ruth from Table 10. My question goes this: what is the rate of tourist tax in similar cities around the EU countries compared to Dublin?
So that's a good question. It varies quite a lot. I mean, the ones that I would know a little bit about, Venice has a tourist tax that varies by season. So in low season, I think it's like €1 or €2, and then in high season, it goes up to €5 a night. And a couple of German cities, for example, they have tourist taxes which tend not to vary by season, but they're somewhere around kind of €2 to €3 a night. And the interesting thing about them is that they're quite efficient from a government point of view, because the actual collection, of course, is done by the hotel. So the hotel just adds it onto your bill, and then it makes a return at the end of the tax year. So it doesn't require kind of extensive administrative structures that you might have to have with other taxes. You effectively transfer the burden of collection onto the hotels. So it varies quite a bit. They're not without controversy, though, and that's the reason I give you the Venice one. There's quite a bit of controversy about the Venice property tax, and it ties into lots of debates about the kind of structure of tourism in Venice, but also where the revenues go. In some countries as well, it's probably worth mentioning that the tourist tax is often connected to service benefits for tourists. So, for example, in some of the German cities, if you pay the tourist tax, you usually get free public transport in the city transport system. So you pay your €3 a day, but then you get a little docket that allows you to access the public transport system for free. So there's kind of an advantage built into the tourist tax. So in terms of thinking about it, you could think about a whole variety of different ways. Who would pay it, how much they would pay, where the revenues would be retained, but then as well whether there would be any kind of inducement or positive benefit for tourists who are staying in the area.
Thanks, Ruth, and Table 10 for that question. Now we move to Table 8, please, and Mary.
Yeah, I think the question has been answered, actually. We were just looking at Finland and the graph that you gave yesterday. The taxes and the salaries that they pay are obviously much higher there. So we were wondering, when you're looking at Dublin, what would you suggest is a workable alternative to raising funds?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the property tax is kind of the obvious answer there, but it's also worth saying that the Finnish government centrally also gives more money to their local authorities. So they actually transfer money to the local authorities, and then the local authorities use that money to deliver services at the local level. I think in one of the presentations they were going through some of the examples of the really concrete educational and welfare services that are delivered by the local authorities. So some of that is paid for locally, but quite a bit of it is also transferred from central government. So yeah, that would probably be one of the options.
Okay, thank you for that. Table 2, you have 3 questions there from Leslie, 4 questions from Killian, from Shane. You might just have a quick chat there. Which one you'd like to ask? Francis as well. You had a question as well.
Francis also.
Thank you.
Hi,
Francis from Table 2. I'm interested if Dr. Reidy believes that it would be a good idea to disband the 4 councils, from a finance perspective, to work under a newly elected, directly elected mayor. Would it simplify the financing aspect?
I think that would take me a little bit beyond my expertise now, because disbanding, I presume you mean amalgamating 4 local authorities,
or changing the structure. Given that Dublin City Council is quite large, and then the other 3 councils are smaller, and would it simplify the budgeting and the financial work?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think you'd probably want to have reasons for why you would amalgamate local authorities beyond pure finance, to be honest, because you'd be creating a huge local authority. So I think that takes us kind of beyond the finance conversation, to be honest. That's a bigger decision than just finances.
So otherwise the directly elected mayor would have to, work with all 4 councils, so it would complicate the mayor's role.
I mean, I see what you're saying, but I suppose that's a structural matter, and it's probably for yourselves to decide in terms of your final recommendations about whether you want to, integrate the 4 local authorities, or you could create a regional tier of governance above the 4 local authorities and then put the mayor on top of that. There are a variety of different models, but I suppose that kind of from a financial point of view, what you want, if you want a powerful directly elected mayor, is that there has to be some mapping of the financial powers to the mayor. What happens at the lower level, I think, is a question of structure and what's the most efficient kind of structure. But efficiency in local government is not always bigger. That's, I think, important to keep in mind because of what I was kind of showing you yesterday. Local authorities do different things. So amalgamating different local authorities doesn't necessarily make the service delivery more efficient. So those are quite large questions, and I'm not sure finance alone could give you a final decision,
We now move to table 11, and we had 3 questions, one from Jason, a question from Kriya, and we had a question from James on offsetting taxes. So do you want to do a quick little debate there and come up with what's the best question, having listened to some of the questions already?
Yeah. Thanks, this is Jason from table 11. So question is in relation to funding and local autonomy, local authority autonomy.
Mm-hmm.
And, is there any potential for community funding amongst the citizens and local authorities to fund or help fund major projects within Dublin? Or, perhaps is there any international examples where this is already in place?
Sorry, can I ask, what do you mean by community funding?
Well, I guess this would be, in this case, direct involvement of citizens funding into infrastructure projects or other projects, as opposed to just taxation, but directly, funding and buying into particular projects.
Maybe like crowdsourcing or something like
exactly,
that? Okay.
Yes, yeah.
Okay. I mean, in principle, there's no reason why you couldn't crowdsource funding for a piece of infrastructure, but infrastructure is very expensive. So, I mean, you could envisage a scenario where a community does local funding to support a particular amenity in their area. In fact, most of our communities are doing that all the time. They're funding their tidy towns committees and all kinds of local initiatives. So they run lots of local things on the ground, raffles and draws and table quizzes to fund kind of smaller pieces of development. So, I mean, I think we already probably have quite active communities in Ireland and a lot of activity happening on the ground in that area. And actually local authorities support a lot of that work. They come in on the side, but in terms of larger projects, I mean, I think there would be barriers. But it is worth mentioning, though, a tool that is associated with Brazil, actually, and that's participatory budgeting. And I don't know if you've been discussing that at any stage. And that's actually a form of decision-making that's in the same kind of family of decision-making as citizens' assembly. So it's a kind of a tool of deliberative democracy. And quite a number of local authorities have been using it. It's been used quite widely, actually, in Scotland. And that's where you bring in groups of citizens together and they're allocated a pool of money, or there's a decision to be made about a pool of money and how it might be spent. And the citizens adjudicate on what the best way of spending that money is. Is it a park or is it a bridge? And it's been particularly successful in Scotland for engaging young people. So, for example, they convene these participatory budgeting events and they bring in representatives from, the young Scots and they adjudicate, should it be on a skateboard park or should it be, some other piece of infrastructure for young people. And the citizens take that decision. So it's structured within the local authority, but it's direct involvement in citizens in making budgetary decisions. So that's also something else. We haven't been doing as much of that, but there's certainly been some experiments in it, but there would be a role for more of that, for example.
Thanks, Theresa. Participative budgeting. Would we call that subsidiarity? Is that what the academics would call it? Pushing that autonomy down? No?
Definitely going on the right line.
Yeah, very interesting. Thank you. Building on the theme from yesterday, transport in the city and county of Dublin. Question from table 12, please, and Monica.
Hello. Would you consider putting in place a congestion charge comparative to London? That's currently £15 a day to drive into a congested area. There's a fine of £180 or £160 if you don't pay it. It's £80 if you pay it within 14 days. Thank you.
Thank you. I mean, I think Theresa's opinion on a congestion charge doesn't really matter. But the question is more to put it back to you to say, should the directly elected mayor in Dublin have the power to introduce a congestion charge if they feel that that's a valuable thing to do for the city? So what kind of financial powers do you want to have the directly elected mayor to have? And that's exactly the kind of powers that directly elected mayors have in other places. Anne Hidalgo in Paris has used similar tools, particularly in relation to her cycling initiative. So it's more a case of, when you think about the powers that you want to give to the mayor, do you want them to be quite extensive? With them having real capacity to both raise money but also alter behaviour. And that's a really good example of a novel charge. So, because somebody asked this morning what other kinds of things we do, there's lots of small user charge type changes you could introduce that could be quite effective. We already do lots of those. We already charge for parking and we charge for lots of things to either encourage or discourage types of behaviour. So there's a whole suite of measures that could potentially be available to the Dublin mayor. And the question is whether you think they should or shouldn't have those.
That's very thought-provoking. It's in your hands, Assembly members. We had 5 from question table 3, so I better go to table 3. If you want to have a little moment to decide which of those 5 questions is most relevant at this particular point of the discussion. Thank you.
Hi, Dr. Reidy. So a question from table 3 is, it was our perception that rates are harder to collect from a local authority than they are from a centralised government, as in people don't necessarily are slower to pay their bin charges or rent to a local authority than they are to revenue, for example, because there might be, I guess, more fines or, coming from revenue. So do you think that local authorities, or how would local authorities enforce collection of payments if they had more payments to collect?
I'm not sure I have any kind of real pearls of wisdom there, other than to confirm what you're saying in relation to commercial rates, that they are difficult to collect. I'd add that they're also complicated, that the way in which the commercial rate is composed, it's on the kind of rateable value of the property, so you have commissioners' evaluation and you've quite elaborate procedures to actually get to the commercial rate, so it's quite a complex process to get there. Well, I think it's probably worth saying that revenue, of course, are very effective at what they do. Revenue will find you. But it's also the case that, you know, some businesses, it's not as clear-cut in terms of their ability to pay always. So some of it, there's always a gap between the amount of money a local authority thinks it's going to get in, and there's kind of the bad debts commercial rates. But it's not simply straightforward that it's companies that refuse to pay. Sometimes they can't pay, and that's part of the composition. And having revenue collected wouldn't necessarily change that arrangement. And there's also variation. Some local authorities are more effective than other local authorities at managing that. So there are probably administrative learnings that could be shared among the local authorities. But I mean, bin charges is an interesting one. I mean, they're largely privatised across the country now, and it's private companies and all the different local authorities, and they'll still tell you they find it a little bit difficult to collect the bin charges. So there's no easy solutions to those kinds of things, but they could certainly improve some of their procedures, learn from other local authorities. But I don't think there's transferring the collection of commercial rates to revenue, for example. It kind of goes against the spirit of devolution and the spirit of companies actually paying at the level at which they receive the services. So it's kind of not in line with, I suppose, best practice in terms of thinking about local government finance.
Table 7, Sophie, this question might have been answered, but if you'd like maybe to pose the question, if you believe it hasn't been.
Sophie, table 7. If there was a devolution of powers to a directly elected mayor, would the funding follow this devolution from central government? Would that represent a burden rather than a benefit?
I mean, this is one where I'm afraid I'm going to have to ask it back of you, because this is a really unusual moment in the evolution of local government, where you have, like, looking at the terms of reference, almost being given a blank sheet to define what the directly elected mayor would do. So in terms of the financial procedures, I mean, there's certainly the way the question is framed to you, there's a lot of scope for you to talk about how the mayor should be funded and what financial powers that mayor should have. So, I mean, things that you might want to think about are who should lead the budgetary discussions when or if a directly elected mayor is in place. So at the moment, it's the chief executive within the local authority who really does most of the budgetary work. I mean, it's the councillors that decide, but it's the chief executive and their team that, you know, starts the discussions, sets out the figures, looks at the parameters. And that's where the real power is, because when you come in after a draft budget has been done, even if you don't agree with it, you're trying to unpick it. The power is in putting the budget together. So one of the questions is, who should have that power? Should that power be with the directly elected mayor? And then I think it's quite complex, because it comes back to your question, Francis, which is how should that power, where should that power sit in relation to the other local authorities? So would they have their own budgetary processes? Would you create a new budgetary process for the directly elected mayor? Would there be revenue sharing between the mayor and the 4 local authorities? And these are questions to which, unfortunately, there aren't any kind of particularly easy answers, but you have this wonderful opportunity to actually assess this and make those kinds of decisions. So there aren't answers that I can give you, but these are the right questions to be asking. But it's essentially, it's up to yourselves. And the second part of your question was, you know, if you devolve, would money follow the role? I mean, money has to follow the role, otherwise it's not meaningful. So finances are inherently built into this. There's really little point in creating a directly elected mayor unless they have some budget that's flowing in their direction, and unless they have some capacity to determine where that budget goes. The question is how big that budget is, and where the money comes from, and then in particular how it relates to these other tiers of government. But there are lots of models, Paris, Rome, Manchester I know you heard from, and a lot of them operate quite similarly actually.
Some great questions, and I'm going to continue on. I'll ease into my own time at the very end. So we got 3 tables to go, and then I think we'll have gone to each table that posed questions. So it'll be in this order. Table 6, you have 2 questions. You might just consider which one you'd like to ask. Then we go to table 2. You also had 2 questions, and you might consider which is the best. And then table 1, you had 4. So please consider which is the best question to ask. So 6, 5, and 1. And again, thanks again to Dr. Reidy for her time.
Hi, it's Paula for table 3. So our question is, what are the reasons for us raising only 3% of revenue on a local level? And are there constraints by central government on that?
The answer is yes and yes. So there are constraints on the revenue that can be raised by local authorities from the local property tax. There's a national system of valuation which has just been gone through in the past year, and local authorities there's a set rate nationally for the local property tax, and local authorities can vary that rate up and down within quite a narrow margin. So if a local authority wanted to engage in some major new initiative, they don't have the power at present to come in and double the rate of property tax. They can only increase it up by 0.15. I defer to a councillor in the room for the exact amount, but they're quite restricted in terms of how much they can raise in the revenue. So that's why if you were going to increase the property tax, that would require a significant decision of the government to change that, to free up the local authorities to be able to raise the revenue more extensively. But it comes back to that other question that I was asked earlier. There's primary legislation coming for the directly elected mayor, can't be created without it. So you could make a recommendation that allowed the directly elected mayor to have more scope to vary the rate of property tax. That could be something you could put in, but it would have to be done through primary legislation. Yeah.
So it's table 5, table 1, and then table 9. You had 2 questions as well. So 5, 1, and 9. That will conclude the questions.
Nicole, table 1. Our question was, if local government was to take back responsibility for services, would the money that they raise go back to the locality? So like, for example, say motor tax used to be collected locally. If they were to take back responsibility, should that money follow suit? And I suppose, or would it stay in the centralised manner where it's distributed to them? And is it realistic that the funding could be reallocated locally? And I suppose just hearing from everybody else saying as well, do you think there would be more buy-in and councillors would be willing to up things like property tax if they knew the full amount was going to stay locally?
The first thing I'll tell you is that there is a change coming in the local property tax. So at the moment you have that equalisation mechanism in place, where kind of better off local authorities subsidise less well-off local authorities, and that's due to be phased out from next year onwards. So there's a change coming in the structures. So local property tax, then all of the revenue is going to stay in the local authority area. So it'll be interesting to see when that happens, particularly for the Dublin local authorities, whether that changes the incentive structures that the councillors have in terms of raising extra revenue. If they know all of that revenue will stay in their local area, well, then maybe it changes the incentive structure. So that might be useful for you to be aware of. The other question you ask is a slightly it's slightly more difficult, I suppose. I mean, if the government devolves powers to local authorities, the money will have to follow the function, if you want. There's no point devolving responsibilities and roles to local authorities without actually giving the financing to deliver those particular roles. The question is, which roles would those be, and whether the money would continue to be collected centrally and devolved through that central fund down to local authorities, or whether the government might decide, actually, we want it paid for at local level, so we're going to change the structure of local financing and allow local authorities to raise more revenue at local level. So there are different ways they could do it. And it'd really be kind of a function of whoever is in government and what they decided would be the best way of proceeding with it. I mean, effectively, the government has all the power when it comes to all of this, so it would be a decision of the minister responsible. But if they were, say, we had very interesting talk yesterday on childcare, if they were to devolve all childcare response, I mean, there are lines of revenue funding childcare already as it stands. So you'd have to imagine that they would have to devolve in some way to local level to support the provision of that service if it was going to become more extensive at local level. But how they would do it would very much be, for open debate and discussion, and ultimately at the discretion or the determination of the government.
Thanks, Nicole, on table 5. Now table 1 and then table 9. Thank you.
Karen from Table.
Hi, Karen.
If the directly elected mayor had the power to raise taxation, what are the restrictions and limits that they would have in doing so?
Thank you. They would be whatever the government determine. I'm sorry, I'm giving really answers that are well, it depends on the government, but ultimately it really would depend on how the government actually sets it up. So you could imagine a scenario, say for example, if you all recommend that the directly elected mayor should have a role in the setting of the local property tax. There probably would be parameters put on that, in the same way that there are parameters put on the property tax at present. The government does the national valuation, and local authorities can vary the rate at which it's levied, but within quite a narrow frame. If it was a directly elected mayor, your group could recommend that that spectrum could be either widened very considerably. You might decide it should be narrowed very considerably, that they shouldn't have the power, or you could say that there should be no limit at all on the directly elected mayor. So it would rather depend on how you go back to the government. It would be up to them, and it would be in the legislation as to how the rate would actually, how the property or tax or the commercial rates or any of the other services. The question is whether the mayor should be in charge of those things, and to what extent they would be in charge of those things. And I guess it will eventually be a case of your recommendations, discussion in the department, and we see what finally gets into the legislation. Yes, but it's not independent of your deliberations. You have the capacity to really shape that and make recommendations, but ultimately it would go to the department and the minister, and they would make an adjudication, and of course it'd have to be passed in the Dáil, so it would have to have democratic support. Yeah.
Thanks, Karen, on table 1 for that question. And finally, table 9.
Good morning, Dr. Reidy. James is my name, and I think our table found this a really interesting discussion, so thanks a million. I think most of our stuff has been touched on already, but we did have a quick question in relation to the funding provided to the local governments from central. I think we've heard a lot about there being kind of strings and conditions attached to it, and we wondered whether you have seen examples where the money is just the money is given to local government and the power to decide where it gets divested sits locally as opposed to centrally.
Yeah, that's a very good question. I mean, it comes in different ways. Like there's a general allocation, and then there are specific allocations. But the local authorities, the money doesn't go into a local authority from the general allocation to go to particular types of things. You know, local authorities have to pay for salaries, they have to pay for services. So there's a general amount that comes from central government that goes into the pot that the local authority has, along with their local property tax revenues, the money they raise from service charges, and that pays for everything they do. But they do get a lot of kind of earmarked grants, kind of specific purpose grants for varieties of different things, initiatives that are happening. So it might be the expansion of the library, and the money comes perhaps for on the capital side here now for building, and they've applied, they get money, and then that money comes. And they generally have to build a library. They can't go back and say, well, you know, oops, but we actually decided 2 roundabouts on the main road were a better use of it. Like, so that's the kind of thing. When I'm talking about specific funding, it's usually quite, you know, the subject of elaborate and long discussions, and it comes for providing very specific types of infrastructure, or it might be specific types of initiatives. For example, during COVID, there was quite a bit of money channeled through the local authorities to go out into the community to do a variety of different things. At the moment, local authorities are receiving a lot of dedicated funding for cycling infrastructure, for example. So that's coming from central government, and it's specifically for cycling infrastructure. That's how it's actually used in the local authorities. In the kind of research literature on local government financing, there's generally a criticism made of Ireland that too much of the money that comes from central government comes for those kinds of specific grants, and actually that they should receive much more money in the kind of general pot. So that they would have more discretion in terms of how to spend it. And that was one of the points I was making yesterday, that when you go down through the budget line by line, at the end of the day, the kind of discretionary part that local councillors get to kind of adjudicate on is actually a relatively small pool of money, because a lot of it has already been factored into the, you know, spending obligations of the local authorities.
Well, Dr. Reidy, thank you so much for that. It's been a very engaging session for our opening part of Sunday morning. My key takeaways, as you said, the Tunol Saronach, the free citizens have that free capacity and that capacity to shape this in whatever way you deem appropriate. So it's been very good, a very good session. Thank you so much for your time and safe journey home. And give a warm thank you to Dr. Theresa Reidy. Gurmagat.